Thank you, Bernane, and welcome to all. I will start this meeting with a land acknowledgement. I'm glad that we are able to gather tonight. It's wonderful to bring everyone together to do this important work. But before we start, I would like to make some acknowledgements. We are meeting on land that has been occupied by humans since the glaciers retreated over 10,000 years ago. I want to acknowledge those first people. We are meeting on the land that has been home to various nations over these thousands of years. I want to acknowledge the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Shawanoton nations. These are the First Nations of this land. We are meeting on land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, which states that anyone that takes up residence in the Great Lakes Basin, as we have, owes it to everyone else to share the resources and not deplete them. We are meeting on the land covered by Treaty Number 45.5, the Saugeen Treaty, signed in 1836. I acknowledge that our presence here is governed by this treaty and call upon our government to honor it. We are, if we are non-Indigenous, immigrants and settlers, as I am an immigrant. The true history of this land hasn't been taught in our schools, and we have much to learn about the true relations between the Indigenous people and Canadians. I acknowledge that I am on this learning journey and invite you to learn with me. The Indigenous people cared for this land and practiced sustainable living so as to not destroy the environment. We have much to learn from their teachings, and I wish to acknowledge what a deep privilege it is for us to gather here. As part of our reconciliation work, I wish for stronger ties to the Indigenous nations we live alongside today. I hand it over to Bill.
Thank you, Anya. Good evening and welcome to our sixth webinar. We will plan additional webinars as the months roll on. As you know, all of us are very focused on October 28th, 2024, when we will have a by-election and a referendum to determine whether or not South Bruce is a willing host community. So with that, I'm going to introduce David Donnelly. He is one of Canada's leading environmental lawyers and an award-winning advocate for the smart growth. He has represented public interest groups and ratepayers to some of the Ontario's key environmental battles, including Oak Ridge, Big Bay, Nelson aggregates, and Walkerton Commission inquiry. David is a founding member of some of Ontario's most important environmental campaigns. It includes the Greenbelt, Green Energy Act, SLAP Suite, and Smart Growth Green Building Standards. He goes to court regularly to protect our environment, to protect the green space and the Aboriginal cultural heritage. David has a law degree from the University of Windsor and a master's degree in environmental studies from York University. Prior to practicing law, David was a professional planner and an executive director of Environmental Defence Canada from 1988 to 1996. Over to you, David, and let's get the slides roll.
Thank you very much, Bill and Bernane and Anya. It gives me great pleasure to appear before you tonight. I've been involved in this issue for a number of years now, and council, your local municipal council, seems to be getting deeper and deeper in the hole with respect to democracy, transparency, and public participation. I hope this evening to shed a little light on the process. The title of my presentation is Nuclear Waste, Where's the Fairness in the NWMO's Willing Host Decision? And constant with my being living in the technological age, I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation to take us through this, if you don't mind. Bill, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Good, David.
Terrific. Okay. Welcome everybody. Thank you for indulging me. I actually hate PowerPoint presentations. Try and picture Winston Churchill appearing before Parliament saying, "We will fight them on the beaches." Next slide. Landings. Next slide. Hedgerows. However, I will do my best. So with that, I will try and wind on here with the slides. However, they seem to be frozen. You just bear with me for 1 second. It worked in rehearsal, of course.
Dave has been involved with Protect Our Water. There you go, Dave. You're who we are.
Okay, there we are. And because I used up all my time on figuring out the technology, I'll just say I'm trying to convince you that I'm great. It's probably not true, but there you go. Our firm does have a considerable experience with the issue of the disposal of low-level radioactive waste in South Bruce. We formerly represented Save Our Saugeen Shores, which was a group involved in a judicial review of the proposal for the low and intermediate waste disposal that was, again, an NWMO project. We brought a judicial review. However, the federal minister suspended the environmental assessment, which essentially made that process go away. I thought that process in comparison to this one was sort of night and day in terms of the fairness, the transparency, the efficacy of the environmental assessment. And I wonder if your counsel doesn't owe it to you, Bill, and others in the organization to go back and revisit that process, because at the very least, it didn't include a ridiculous 140-year binding agreement that would essentially silence opposition and shut down the democratic process. So there is a precedent here that could be followed. I'm not suggesting that process was perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but at least it was fair and didn't muzzle the public. So when I was executive director of a group called the Canadian Environmental Defence Fund, which became Environmental Defence, we were engaged with a group called the Friends of the Indian Nation and the Indian Nation itself in response to low-level military flight training originating from CFB Goose Bay. There were court cases, there were occupations of the runway, there were injunctions, and eventually the Department of National Defence, really the government of Canada, convinced NATO to suspend its interest in expanding the military flight training at CFB Goose Bay, and the problem went away. Well, as recently as this year, it looks like the government of Germany and other European countries are interested in reestablishing low-level military flight training. D&D says that it's open to future requests, even as the Quebec Innu and others have stated they are formally and unanimously rejecting that resumption. I include this slide for this reason. Even if you are successful in your October 2024 referendum regarding a willing host community, it does raise the issue of how permanent that resolution is. It seems that governments, the federal government, provincial governments, are always open to restarting or resuming application processes. So there's one glaring omission from this willing host agreement that was signed, and that is, what if there is a decision not to be a willing host? Can they move down the road 20 kilometers? Can they restart in 2 years? And as we've seen with low-level military flight training, and I hope this doesn't come to pass, but there is no guarantee on the other side. So I will look at the agreement in a moment, but it commits you and your council to 138 years of payments and really support for the facility. But there's nothing on the back end in case, one, you decide not to be a willing host community, or two, if you change your mind. Low-level military flight training is an example where the public simply isn't protected the way the NWO is. The second issue from my past was our opposition in support of the fishers and ferry workers on Prince Edward Island. There was a plebiscite regarding the Confederation Bridge back in 1989 before it was built. It was completed in 1997. The question that was put to the public on PEI is, do you support a fixed link from the mainland to the island? And of course, the proponents of the fixed link, mostly businesses, were advertising that this could be a tunnel, which wouldn't disrupt the currents in the strait, the fishery, and so on. And even though the final result was 59 to 41% in favor of the fixed link, many people, and there have been papers written on this, many people feel that that referendum, that plebiscite, wasn't in fact fair, and that the provincial government and the proponents of the bridge were not transparent with respect to what they were advertising for the public. And this, again, is a fear that I have with respect to the question that's being asked in the referendum in this case, which is, it describes a deep rock geological depository. It doesn't describe all the modalities, the issues with respect to opening the agreement up, how many tons are going to be taken, how is the thing to be decommissioned. There are so many unanswered questions. And of course, it's an evolving situation. And I don't think that the referendum, the one-time referendum, is fair. The fixed link being an example of a plebiscite that I think in some people's minds anyway, was a failure to protect the public. I raised the issue of SLAP suits because the binding agreement that the South Bruce Council has signed does expose residents, really, in particular, current and future municipal councillors, to the notion of being SLAP. A SLAP is a strategic lawsuit against public participation. Now, I had the misfortune of representing a group that opposed the Big Bay Point Marina, now called Friday Harbor, on Lake Simcoe. That was a 400-acre lake that was built into the shore of Lake Simcoe. A marina was put on it with what are now condos. We opposed it. Me and individuals in the group were slapped ultimately for over $100 million. I was sued personally for $3.2 million. That was resolved, of course, but it shows you the types of risks that people take when they speak out. There should be an ironclad binding agreement that anybody, including municipal councillors who want to speak out against this facility, should be protected, and that's missing from the agreement. In fact, in Stratford, Ontario, people opposed the Gigny float glass plant. There was an administrative zoning order issued by Premier Ford that was done in secret. People were not advised of it. People complained to council. It turned out something like 150 of their meetings out of 460 were conducted in camera. This was deemed to be illegal. And the people who spoke out against that were banned for 3 months from attending city council. So this is something we have to be vigilant about, which is, this is happening in Ontario right now. We have to be sure that the rules are put in place to protect people from SLAP suits. They are not there now in the willing host agreement that was signed just recently by South Bruce Council. Now, with respect to plebiscites, the way the Municipal Elections Act is written, this will be conducted under the Ontario Municipal Act. My first concern as a lawyer is that because this is a federal corporation, it is essentially regulated under federal law, that it should probably be regulated under a federal statute. Be that as it may, it's true that in 2020, there was a 59% turnout in the South Bruce municipal election. In 2018, that was a 46% turnout. And this is incredibly important because what council has determined is that if there is less than a 50% participation rate in the referendum that will occur as to whether South Bruce is a willing host community or not, then it will be left to council to decide whether they're a willing host or not. And I don't think that's appropriate for the simple reason that, one, South Bruce has rarely, if ever, had more than 50% turnout in a municipal election. And two, and this is critical, studies of referenda and turnout rates have shown that the turnout rates for referenda in what they call direct democracy are considerably lower than in municipal or provincial or state elections. In other words, it's eminently predictable that less than 50% of people will turn out to vote. We know that. That's what the studies show. And yet this process, in my opinion, is set up for the grassroots people to fail. That's the first reason. The second reason is there is an unbelievably unbalanced issue with respect to fairness and funding. The NWMO spends over $50 million annually to convince Indigenous communities and municipal councils to become willing host communities for nuclear high-level spent fuel waste. The source for this funding of expenditures comes from electricity bills of consumers. That's me and you. And this activity involves a massive marketing campaign with ads in weekly newspapers, promoting the project, funding direct staff within municipal organizations to advance the project within their community, and other forms of funding in the community. If you live in South Bruce, no doubt you've seen it. Now, the concern I have about this is that, in fact, since the NWMO was established, they spent more than $1 billion on research around selecting communities, evaluating deep geological waste disposal, but very little on alternative technologies for actually dealing with high-level nuclear waste, which of course we all know is very dangerous. The concern that I have is they spent $160 million last year simply on finding a willing host community, and that those are, of course, pre-tax dollars, and in fact, they're tax dollars. We spend them as residents. The problem that, Protect Our Waterways and others who participate, you're spending after-tax dollars. You have to donate this money, and you've already paid tax on it. It's a lopsided funding arrangement, which is critically unfair to the grassroots and to residents. Now, there is a way to remedy this, and that is intervenor funding. Now, the Ontario Energy Board has given nearly $5 million to 53 intervenor groups who participate, including consumer groups, manufacturers, farmers, landowners, Indigenous communities, who have participated in setting energy rates and projects in the past. In Ontario, from 88 to 96, we had the Intervenor Funding Project Act, which expired, but this provided public money to citizens groups who were qualified to oppose things like garbage dumps and other large facilities like nuclear plants. What I'm saying is that any process that is fair has to have intervenor funding. There is no way you can have this plebiscite and say to people that it is fair because of the incredibly lopsided nature of the funding agreement. This, to me, is disqualifying on its face, and this should be remedied. There are lots and lots of examples in Ontario and across Canada of intervenor funding processes. There should be one in this case. There is not enough information known about the project for people to make a credible or accurate assessment and then vote. For more than 12 years, NWMO has been promising communities that site selection practices in our government that only can-do fuel will be placed in the DGR, and the project timeline for operating the DGR will start in the early 2040, last approximately 4 years. That's not true. There's a huge amount of information that is missing that does not give people the chance to vote properly in this referendum. Now, South Bruce has very recently signed the $418 million hosting agreement. There was very little public consultation with respect, very little engagement. The vast majority of these meetings, this deal was negotiated in camera, in secret, excluding local residents. The deal has really, a lot of it has nothing to do with deep rock geological disposal. It has everything to do with paying millions of dollars to the community to accept this facility. And it raises this incredibly interesting question. If the facility is so safe, if it will have so little impact on the environment, if it poses virtually no risk, why are they paying almost $500 million to your community for things like community facilities and community services and people, community, and culture? This makes no sense. This deal needs to be audited in my respectful submission. And in fact, this deal could lead to court. Probably the most troubling part of this community host agreement or willing host agreement are the gag orders. The provisions in section 3.6 and 6.3 require municipalities to show support for the project prior to giving any site-specific science and technical information. In an EA process, as you know, it's an iterative process. You evaluate it as the project goes along. There's a kind of a call and response with respect to peer review that ultimately leads to a recommendation. And that recommendation is then twinned up with reports from the public, who then advise the minister, and the minister issues the final report. This is the opposite of that. You're about to engage in a referendum that's going to commit you for 138 to support for the project. Let's get specific. Hosting agreement 3.2.1. Upon delivery of a community decision that the community of South Bruce is a willing host, the municipality acknowledges, agrees that A, it is a willing host for the project in accordance with the terms of the agreement. B, it supports the base project scope and will participate in any applicable regulatory process in accordance with the terms of the agreement. And C, it shall, in accordance with the terms of this agreement, respect the regulatory approvals that have been or may in the future be granted to anybody on the project, meaning no opposition. Gets worse. 3.2.2. Upon delivery of a community decision, the community of South Bruce and Wheeling Host, and subject to the exercise of its municipal authority, its rights under this agreement, the municipality shall, and this means shall for all time, not engage in any action that could frustrate, delay, or interfere with, or stop NWMO from proceeding with the project in accordance with regulatory approvals, including the construction, operation of the facility, and the center of expertise. B, use best efforts to attend, but only at NWMO's reasonable request expense, non-regulatory forums, including international forums related to the project, and support the base project scope at such forums. They're being compelled to support this project. Now, I have to ask you, what if South Bruce comes to its senses and elects a mayor and council who opposes this facility? If this Wheeling Host referendum goes through on what could be a turnout of in the teens or 20s in a percentage in terms of the turnout of the public, future councils are bound for all time by this decision, even if the technical reports come back and say that the thing is a disaster, that it could be very disruptive to the community. If the regulatory approvals are granted, your future councils are bound by this decision. It's ridiculous. This, I think, affects your charter rights and needs to be challenged. Less than 50% of the vote, then council decides. This is under the MEA. This, I think, is something that needs to be revisited. I'll try and quickly here. One solution that we have to this problem is to change the nature of the referendum. To make it fair, the contest should be grassroots, and that the winner should be decided by the largest number of registered voters who have physically signed a petition. This deals with a whole host of issues, including the incredible effect of all the millions of dollars that have gone into advertising and promoting the facility so far. That's been blatantly unfair and makes the contest lopsided. In making it a registered voter petition signing contest, this means people have to meet face to face, people have to meet their neighbors, and if they don't feel compelled one way or the other, they don't have to sign the petition. But through a petition process, you're not under the MEA, you're not bound by this 50% or less than 50% turnout in council decides. Fair is fair. The one who gets the most signatures wins. This deals with another interesting problem, which is that of absentee landowners or people who are not regularly living in the community. Some people may want all the millions of dollars in community benefits, but don't actually live in the community, are only part-time residents. If they're not there, they can't sign the petition. I think that is probably the fairest outcome. It's just one recommendation of many to true up or make fair this process. But I have to say, on balance, given everything that we know and everything that we've learned and everything that's going to be happening technically, the Wheeling Host Community Agreement that was signed is, in my view, an extraordinarily poor document. It's a very unfair, prejudicial contract. It creates a lopsided process that needs to be overturned. And I think there's a very real possibility that is going to lead to court action that will be successful. And with that, I thank you. And later in the program, I believe there'll be questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. You gave us some very interesting things to think about. And we all know that this process has been heavily favored towards the NWMO. Their 9-step process is all about securing a willing host. They are not really that interested in the welfare of the residents or the community of Ignace or South Bruce. So with that, I'm going to now talk to or bring on Ollie Hendrickson, who's after receiving his PhD in ecology from the University of Georgia in 1981, Ollie moved to Canada to take a postdoctoral position at the University of Guelph. In 1983, he joined the Canadian Forest Service as a research scientist at the Petawawa National Forestry Institute in Chalk River, Ontario. He participated in the efforts to clean up the Chalk River laboratories of Atomic Energy of Canada as a researcher for the concerned citizens of Renfrew County, regularly appearing at Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission hearings. Between 2000 and 2012, he worked for the Environment Canada as a science focal point for the Convention of Biological Diversity, He remains active in the nuclear cleanup efforts and also has served as the editor-in-chief of the scientific journal Biodiversity, president of the Ottawa River Institute, and a board member and a conservation committee chair with the Sierra Club Canada Foundation. So, Ole, over to you and welcome.
Oh, thanks, Bill. I'm going to try to share my screen. I hope this works. I'm kind of like David. Can be a bit, challenged when this happens. That's not working. Select what I want to share. Screen.
Yeah, you started. Good. You're on, Al.
See if I can. All right. The webinar announcement says that I'm supposed to leave a question for those attending. Do the CNSC's activities favor the nuclear industry or Canadian citizens? So I kind of took that as my starting point because the CNSC has awarded itself the title of World's Best Nuclear Regulator. And there's a webpage that called the CNSC as a unique regulator, which says that the CNSC has a 70-year history of regulating nuclear safety. Well, sorry, the CNSC is only 24 years old. And it was created from the former Atomic Energy Control Board in the year 2000. And that webpage goes on to make other some questionable claims about the CNSC's protection of the environment, health, safety, scientific integrity, transparency, and so forth. But when the CNSC does say that, quote, Canada's sole regulator for the nuclear activities simplifies the regulatory landscape considerably for regulated parties, I do tend to agree with that statement. It seems the CNSC does do everything in its power to be the best possible regulator for the nuclear industry, and that includes for waste management issues. Certainly, health comes first to mind when people are thinking about nuclear energy, nuclear waste. I'll just quote from the IAEA Fundamental Safety Principles, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And Principle 4 says, for facilities and activities to be considered justified, the benefits that they yield must outweigh the radiation risks to which they give rise. So the IAEA sent a mission to Canada, which a couple of years ago, that suggested that Canada should explicitly include this principle of justification in its legal framework. But Canada refused and said that discretionary decision of reasonable versus unreasonable risk is an exercise of justification. So basically, the CNSC says its commission can decide what is reasonable and what is not. But there's unfortunately a history where the CNSC's decisions would not have been particularly reasonable, I think, in the view of most members of the public. And I listed a whole series of episodes, like when the Bruce reactor was being refurbished, there were over 300 workers exposed to plutonium and other alpha particles. When Quebec's Bureau des Audiences Publiques Environnementales, its Environmental Assessment Bureau, decided to make the uranium mining moratorium permanent, CNSC really pushed back and sent, and that triggered an exchange of letters between Gordon Edwards, who most of you know, and CNSC President Michael Binder. There have been studies showing elevated cancer incidence in people living near Ontario Power Generation nuclear plants, but the CNSC's health experts say, well, it can't have been radiation because their dose estimates suggest that radiation exposure would be too low to be a plausible explanation for excess cancers. Well, they don't consider that maybe their dose estimates might be flawed. There was the incident of the approval of a Peterborough uranium pellet plant next to an elementary school, where one of the commissioners, Dr. Sander Demeter, actually suggested that that decision should be analyzed through application of the as low as reasonably achievable principle, the justification principle, precautionary principle, and relative risk. But he was overridden by the other members of the commission. That IAEA panel that recommended that Canada include justification in its legal framework also recommended reduced dose limits for pregnant nuclear energy workers in the radiation, the regulations for radiation exposure, and also reduced dose limits for apprentices or students, but the CNSC did not act on that. And then there's the most recent issue where it turns out that a lot of homes in Elliott Lake have been built on uranium mine waste, and the reaction of CNSC officials was to issue a smug shrug emoji saying, "It's not our business, we don't care, we're not going to do anything." So that's health. So there's a revolving door between staff, commissioners, industry, federal government departments. They move in and out of the CNSC very fluidly. The CNSC reports to Parliament or through the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, Minister Wilkinson. Now, Minister Wilkinson is also charged under the Nuclear Energy Act with promoting nuclear power. So you've got a minister who's a promoter of nuclear power, which is his responsibility under federal legislation, but is also in charge of the CNSC, and the CNSC president reports directly to the Minister of Natural Resources, and that could be changed. It could be any minister under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, but right now it's the promoter of nuclear power. There have been some questions about the credentials of some of the appointed commissioners. For example, acting president of the CNSC, Timothy Berube, has a Doctor of Divinity in Spiritual Counseling from the University of Metaphysical Sciences, and a PhD from that same university in Metaphysical Sciences. So I don't know. I mean, this is, and questions have also arisen about another commissioner, Marcel Lacroix, who claims to have had some fairly extensive experience at Chalk River Laboratories, but others have said that they don't remember him having been there and done what he claims to have done. There's the problem of the dual role, which at least up till very recently was occupied by Rumina Velshi. She was both the chief executive officer in charge of all the staff of the CNSC commission, but also the president of the commission itself, which is supposed to be independent and supposed to not necessarily just do what the staff tells it to do. Ms. Velshi was also chair of the IAEA Safety Standards Committee while she was chair. So the CNSC has always had quite a bit of international influence. Canada is really unique among OECD countries in giving its regulator sole authority to approve radioactive waste disposal projects. So if this South Bruce DGR gets in front of the CNSC, there's not going to be any elected federal officials or other federal departments that will have a hand in deciding whether it's safe or not. It'll be solely decided by the CNSC. And the CNSC sort of has a reputation, deserved in my view, as a captured regulator with this non-prescriptive approach to the industry. And there have been questions about transparency episodes where the CNSC staff have been accused of withholding, have accused their higher level managers of withholding safety information from commissioners. This made sort of the headlines in the Globe and Mail several years ago. I will talk about the Office of the Auditor General audit of nuclear governance later. Most of you heard that the CNSC secretly lobbied Parliament to exempt small modular reactors from impact assessment, and were successful in getting that exemption in the regulations under the Impact Assessment Act. I'll also discuss how CNSC licenses and the license condition handbooks have been sequentially downgraded and replaced by references to CSA standards. There's very little content anymore in a CNSC, either in a license or a license condition handbook. In recent years, the licenses issued by CNSC have gotten longer and longer, which means fewer and fewer opportunities for the public to participate in hearings and voice their views. They've been substituted by something called RORs, regulatory oversight reports, but the public cannot, those are not opportunities for the public to comment. There's been, I'll talk about the hands-off approach to federal lands projects a little bit more. There's been a history that the chair of the commission, who's also the president, CEO of the staff, holds single person public hearings and sometimes doesn't even give notice for those hearings, and a problem with access to decommissioning plans. So I'm just going to do a couple stories to illustrate some of this. When in 1990, there was a company called SRB Technologies in Pembroke, Ontario, near where our cottage is, which got a license from this CNSC's precursor, the Atomic Energy Control Board, to process tritium, to put gaseous tritium in sealed glass tubes that would go into things like glow-in-the-dark exit signs. So that was 1990. They got their license. In 1994, they had a parent company in the US, which purchased the entire stock of used tritium lights from the US Department of Energy. And then the Canadian subsidiary applied for and got multiple permits from the Atomic Energy Control Board to import lights. And then 1 year later, in 1995, there was an AECB inspector, Doug Scott, who went into the facility in Pembroke, and he found numerous trays and drums of imported used gaseous tritium lights from the US and the UK, and 125,000 curies, which is a huge amount, about 5 quadrillion becquerels. And he found that there were no licenses for the imports from the UK, and there was one license from the US, but it limited to 1,000 curies instead of the 125,000 that they had. So Inspector Scott said the SRB was using a tritium reclamation plant whose purpose had not been fully described to the ACB, and which had thought that the facility would only reclaim tubes manufactured in Pembroke. So he wanted the plant closed, but the control board just basically covered it up, and for over a decade allowed that quote unquote reclamation plant to continue emitting tritium to the environment and contaminating vegetation, drinking water wells. And when there was finally a hearing in the year 2000, they said there's absolutely no risk to the public. And finally, after drinking water well tritium levels raised to such high levels that even the CNSC, which replaced the ACB, couldn't ignore it. They finally shut down that plant for about 18 months and made them clean up. And in 2010, they finally said that that reclamation plant should be not operated. So all that crushed glass with all that tritium still in it got sent to Chalk River at Atomic Energy Control, Atomic Energy Canada Limited, and presumably it could go into the NSDF. So what is this NSDF thing? Many of you probably heard of this. Ottawa River mega dump for 1 million cubic meters, roughly 1 million tons of historic and future radioactive waste from the federal government. And I make that claim that CNSC basically ceased oversight at Chalk River when Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, CNL, was privatized in 2015. People think that Canadian Nuclear Laboratories is a government owned body, but it's not. So in 2018, the CNSC issued what I call an anything goes license to CNL, which that license was amended this January to allow the NSDF to be constructed, but it was hardly changed at all. What it does is it authorizes CNL, and I'll just quote, to prepare a site for, construct, operate, modify, decommission, or abandon a nuclear facility. So CNL can do virtually anything it wants at Chalk River, and there are no hearings required, no real CNSC oversight. And that's been a change since, I'd say, 2018, when the new license, the 10-year license that goes to 2028, was issued by the CNSC. And as I mentioned earlier, that license, basically all the substantive content was deleted. But one of the important points that was deleted was the requirement that a determination of the applicability of CIA 2012, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, must be made by the CNSC, and to see if an EA under CIA might be required for nuclear facilities undergoing decommissioning, construction of new facilities, etc. So that just disappeared. So it's as if there's no requirement anymore for any environmental assessment of projects at Chalk River or other federal nuclear facilities. So that, I mean, those are federal facilities. I'm sure that if there is a DGR and a CNSC licensing process, that there will be some sort of environmental assessment, but just be warned that the CNSC has done everything it can to downgrade both the EA, the environmental assessment, or now the Impact Assessment Act process. So that's why I say there's really no credibility for the environmental assessment process for the NSDF. For example, there was one of those one-man supposed public hearings that took place with no notice or no opportunity for public participation, obviously, about the scope of the EA for the NSDF. It was simply signed off by President Michael Binder in 2017. The CNSC and CNL created a quote-unquote administrative protocol to decide how the licensing and environmental assessment processes would take place. That was amended 5 times, and there had originally been a provision for a dedicated environmental assessment hearing that just disappeared and got folded into a licensing hearing that happened in 2022. The CNSC report for that, or the environmental assessment report for that 2022 licensing hearing, has no references at all. It just repeats CNL claims and dismisses concerns from the public and indigenous groups about the lack of a siting process, the lack of full consideration of alternatives, the absence of provisions for characterization of waste that might go into the NSDF, very little on health risks and so forth. And one particular indigenous group, Kabowek First Nation, which had not been properly consulted prior to that 2022 hearing, insisted on doing on-site its own kind of independent environmental assessment at the NSDF site, and found really important evidence about species at risk like eastern wolves, found bear dens and so forth on the site that hadn't been discussed previously. And they presented that at a hearing in August last year, but you could tell that the CNSC, the two commissioners, were basically not even paying attention, and there was no real response to that hearing. The picture on the left is a scroll that some activist and I printed out, which contained all the materials that were text that was deleted from the license conditions handbook for Chalk River Laboratories for the new license and license conditions handbook that was issued in 2018. So we did get a little bit of publicity around that. We tried to actually take it into the hearing room in the Pembroke Best Western, but they wouldn't let us unroll it there. So we unrolled it upstairs in the lobby of the hotel. They weren't particularly happy about that either. But anyway, it just gives you a visual impression of how little substance there is to CNSC licensing and license processes. So I think I'll leave it at that, Bill. I might have taken up a little too much time, but I thank you for the opportunity to discuss some of our own experiences with Canada's nuclear regulator. So I have to get out of here. Pause share, get out, stop share. There we go.
Bill, you have to unmute.
Yeah, Bill, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, well, thanks, Ollie, for that presentation. It's very informative, and I know you're very closely involved with the whole issue of Chalk River and the mound that's there, and it gives us an opportunity to understand the whole process of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And it does cause us some worry, both in Ignace and in South Spruce, of how these approvals will take place through the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the environmental assessment that will follow. So I think we're ready now to open up to some questions. Bernane, have you got some questions that?
Great. Yes, thanks, Bill. We've got 9 questions in the queue, some really good substantive ones, and some that I think are a little quicker to deal with. And the first one, actually, I'm generally going to send out speakers and encourage the speakers to indicate in the Q&A if there are questions they'd like to take the lead on. But the first question I'm going to actually send to you, Bill. It comes from Matthew, and Matthew asks, would the NWMO please stop spending our money to convince us that what they're doing is correct? Bill, what are the chances of that?
Well, so again, I kind of missed a part of the question. So the question is what we're doing correct, or is it what NWMO?
No, would the NWMO please stop spending our money to convince us that what they're doing is correct? And what do you think? How are they going to do that?
Well, that's going to be a real challenge to, as you know, the NWMO is very much supported by the Canadian government. They're also, their site is under federal law. So any licensed facility at a DGR location is under federal law. So we do have some challenges, but the main thing is stick with the basics of understanding what this project is all about. Radioactive materials is dangerous. There is no other word that I can explain clearly that this has risk associated with it. we are deeply concerned in the case of South Bruce about our drinking water. We're going through aquifers where the drinking water is for all of South Bruce is acquired, and as well as Teeswater River, which runs into the Saugeen and Lake Huron. So those are things that we can do, from making public appearances, talking about the risk, getting people involved, such as tonight's agenda, where people will hear the other side of the story. So far, all we've heard from the NWMO and as well as our councils, including Ignace, is the good stuff. And money seems to buy attention. So it's often, there's a saying that money always trumps environment. And it's unfortunate that is true a lot of the time. So it's our job to make sure that this doesn't happen in our two communities.
Great, thanks, Bill. Next question is from David, and I think it could go to David or it could go to Bill. So I'm going to pass it to David for a first go. Other than that, will be our own legal leader to challenge the shortcomings of the current agreement signed by our current council? And David's put in brackets Harold Settler. I'm not sure if that means the question's coming from Harold, but David, maybe if you could just comment on, what are the sort of legal options available for Kennedy and South Bruce?
Right. So the first rule of the Legal Strategy Club is you don't talk about the Legal Strategy Club. I hate to say it. Well, look, it's not like those questions aren't being asked, and it's not like our firm and there may be a few other lawyers are researching it. They just signed this willing host agreement very recently. There are some what I'll call problems with it. There will be some problems with the referendum that can be predicted. I think that there's a possible charter challenge in there about fettering the discretion of future councils. So those would be some of the very interesting legal angles. Of course, something that didn't come up tonight, but probably should be discussed, is that there is an entirely separate, but very much parallel process that's going on with Indigenous communities and their willingness to accept this facility. They're not part of the willing host agreement. They may sign their own agreement, or they may simply say they don't want the facility, or they may have a referendum themselves. So that would also be a very substantial legal matter should it arise. So the bottom line is there's nothing to report tonight. It's unlikely that we would be reporting legal strategy in a public forum like this, but that rest assured, the leadership of Protect Our Waterways are very attuned to the issues, and we're working on it.
Great, thanks very much, David. Next question, I think I might send this one to you as well, David, but I note that we do have municipal staff from South Bruce associated with the project attending. So if they want to add something in on the chat in response to this, the question is there any way that we can have this referendum opened up to our province, not just our community? I don't know, David or Bill, if you want to comment on that.
David, I'll go over to you.
Okay. Well, I think what's kind of extraordinary is how little consultation engagement has occurred around the referendum itself. And, if you just go online and do your own research, it seems that they have adopted a process that's not made in South Bruce. They've treated it like any other referendum question. And it does beg some interesting questions, which are the downstream, potentially impact people of this facility. Look, radioactive waste is essentially forever. If it was simple to dispose of, it would have been disposed of already, and they wouldn't be paying $500 million to South Bruce for the privilege of getting rid of this stuff. I mean, can you imagine? So I think it does beg the question of what are the rights of neighboring municipalities? What about the counties and regions that surround the area? What about the people on Lake Huron? What about people in Michigan? So I do think that there's a reckoning coming, and I do think that through freedom of information requests and frankly, more engagement with municipal staff, there should be a report written to establish how this referendum process was chosen. What was the community engagement? What experts did they engage? What can they tell us about Switzerland's experience, for example, with referenda, low voter turnout? Who are the people that are voting? Why do referenda typically favor well-educated, high-income people over lower income, less educated people? Was that factored into the decision to proceed with this process that is very prejudicial to what I'll call regular folks? I mean, all those questions must be answered by staff. This is not just some black box where these municipal employees and council just come out and dictate to people. They're being paid by the people who are on this webinar tonight. And there is enough, it's easy to find this information, and they should have availed themselves of it, and they need to come clean with exactly how was this process chosen and why. So, they've got an opportunity to type the message in here right now. This is a public forum. They should feel free to respond to what I'm saying. If they don't do it tonight, then they ought to do it very soon, because people got to get to work on this referendum. And what I'm suggesting is, from my review, it's not fair.
Thanks, David, for that. In addition to the downstream communities, there's also the communities along the transportation route. Next question is future council opposing the project. Is there a way a future council can speak out against the project without consequences? And I think that reference to what's in the hosting agreement. I don't know. Maybe David can start, and Bill, if you want to add to that.
Sure.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, there is no way that any future councils or any staff of the municipality can speak out against the project. If they do, there is an appeal process that's apparently in place or will be in place. But the fact is, at the end of the day, NWMO can stop their payments if they're frustrated, or if the community, the council and the staff associated with the municipality are not doing what they think they should be doing. So that there's nothing in the agreement. There's no exit clause for South Bruce, period.
Great, thanks. Well, David, from your legal review, anything to add to that?
No, just that I find it quite extraordinary that there's no off-ramp to the deal. It's been concluded what I would call backwards, right? So what you should do is have a non-binding, well, there should be two opportunities for the community to get out of this, right? The first is now. If you just don't want to go through the bother and the hassle and the science and the peer reviews and the process, then they should have a very fair way of judging whether it's a willing host. And I would include in that, which I should have said in my report, I would include in that whether 50+1 is the right threshold for accepting high-level nuclear waste. Like, there are lots of referenda where you require 2/3 +1 to satisfy certain things when there are profound changes being proposed. I'll leave that to another day. But the only process that makes sense to me is that you would have an initial referendum that would be, or a petition that would be binding. And if you want to be a willing host community, then you would engage a process. If you don't want, then NWA should go away. After you have worked through the process, then in every other EA process that I have ever been involved in, and I've been involved in scores, there's a decision point at which the science is concluded and the public has had a chance to respond. The peer reviews have been rendered, and the minister, in most cases through environmental assessment, the minister then gets to render a judgment based on everything that he or she has heard. And then and only then do people make a decision about whether they want to proceed or not. So that's what I'm talking about. This should be the off-ramp opportunity. There should be an ability to say whether you're a willing host or not. But that means, what if the science comes back and it's horrible for you? You're bound to it. Now, again, I challenge staff, I challenge the municipality to respond. If they've got a different deal or a secret deal that's behind this or who knows what, then they should come forward. And really what we should have is a debate. The NWMO, the municipality, should put forward their best person who knows everything about this deal and can talk to the community. And the community should have someone step forward, their champion, and we should have a good old-fashioned debate, and we should see who wins at the end of the evening. You wouldn't ever elect a prime minister, a mayor, or somebody else without having a series of debates, all candidate debates, so people can come, they can hear the issues, and you get an advocate, not just someone who's being paid to promote the project, or some municipal councillor who sees all this money coming for God knows what, and didn't run on the platform of having this facility or what have you. Let's have a good old-fashioned debate, and people can make up their minds at the end of it. Look, if Donald Trump and Joe Biden can get together for 2 debates, surely South Bruce can have someone from NWO or their own council step forward, and I think it should be the mayor or a councillor, step forward and defend the thing. If you can't defend the thing in the public forum, you ought not to have signed the agreement. It's $500 million. This is an insane amount of money. There has been not enough public process.
Great, thanks, David. Question for Bill and maybe Anya. I think this is a question to protect our waterways. No nuclear waste. Do we feel we have the Indigenous support in large, meaningful numbers? And what is the general consensus on this? Bill or Anya, do you have any comment on that? I know that Ojibwe Nation has their own process.
I have one comment that you should adjust your microphone. We can't hear you as good.
I'll try.
Thank you.
I'm also in the Robbins Donuts in Geraldton and trying not to shout.
So Bernine, you maybe want to ask the question again.
So the question is, do we feel we have the Indigenous support in large, meaningful numbers? And what is the general consensus on this? Bill, if you want to comment on that.
Right now, in South Bruce, we are not aware of the position that Sun might take. And Sun has been very quiet regarding the process, and we respect that. It's their decision to be made, and how they go about making it is entirely up to them. We would welcome a debate with Sun, but the fact is, we don't want to get in the situation where we feel as though we're influencing another organization.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Next question, someone is commenting, I met with an IAEA, an International Atomic Energy Agency past employee, and he made the comment that dilution is the solution to pollution. Also heard the same quote from an OPG employee, and I remember from the Deep Geological Repository for Low and Intermediate Level Waste, previously proposed by Ontario Power Generation, their calculations were based on using the entire Lake Huron as a dilutant. The questioner says, this is troubling. We get exposed over time with higher levels. I don't know, Ol, if you can comment at all on those, on the levels set by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the exceedance of those levels, the permissive nature of those levels, if you just want to make a comment on that, Ol.
Yeah, really briefly, I think the IAEA does say that disposal means isolation and containment, and it's not supposed to get in the biosphere. So some nuclear industry people talk about dilution, but that's not the international safety norm. In terms of CNSC standards, there's only one number in the radiation protection regulations for the public. It's 1 millisievert for licensed activities. And it's very difficult to make those kinds of the dose models to arrive at that kind of number, single number, are complicated, non-transparent. The ones for the nuclear dumped at Chalk River are, we've never even been able to see them. So, yeah, that kind of standard of just 1 millisievert is not very reassuring.
Thanks, Joel. Now we've got a question from Mary. It's got a bit of a preamble and then 3 questions built in. So Mary writes, the willing host process is very contrived and narrowly scoped engagement process, a far cry from the broad public acceptance to any long-term storage solutions for nuclear waste, as was recommended by the Seaborn panel. That's the panel that reviewed the previous concept, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's concept. Their report came out in 1998 after an 8-year process, 13 months of hearings. What rights and claims can be asserted by those living along the transportation route and downstream from the site to be engaged in the consent process? So this follows on some of our earlier conversation. Could these communities also have standing in the impact assessment? So that would be the impact assessment hearing, which will be the first hearing before the licensing hearing, might be concurrent with the first license hearing. And the second question is, how can the Auditor General be engaged in reviewing the willing host process and the spending of millions of dollars paid by ratepayers to fund this flawed process? And I'm going to ask you to speak to this, Ol, because I know you're familiar with the impact assessment process and the mechanism for individuals and groups participating, becoming participants, but also if you could talk about the petitioning process with the Auditor General, because I know you have experience with that as well as a mechanism for engaging with the Auditor General.
Well, briefly with respect to impact assessment processes, anyone on the transportation route would certainly be able to put in their comments, concerns, hopefully get some participant funding. That's the way these things are supposed to work. In terms of the petitions, yeah, our group has done 8 of them to the Office of the Auditor General, and we think that we triggered an audit of radioactive waste governance, but that we very strongly suspect that audit got suppressed by the CNSC, and that was kind of shocking to me that they would be able to even influence an audit by the Office of the Auditor General. And the reason I say that is because there were retired ACL scientists who were participating, helping the OAG with that audit and communicating back and forth. And then suddenly the lines of communication disappeared. The audit was delayed, and when it came out, it was basically devoid of content. So, but hopefully that doesn't always happen like that. Petitions to the Auditor General trigger a government response. Often that's pretty perfunctory, and so I wouldn't put a lot of effort into doing Auditor General petitions, in my view.
And Ol, can you just please describe the petitioning process with the Auditor General, because it's quite different from what we normally think of as a petition. So if you could just briefly describe that process of preparing, submitting the petition, and the government response that you would receive.
It goes through the Office of the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, which is part of the Auditor General office. And they're very helpful. There are instructions online about how long it should be, how many asks you can make, who you target in government, whether it's a particular minister. I found that working with people in the commissioner's office on petitions was quite positive. And if nothing else, you can get some potential public exposure through your petitions. We've got them all, our 8 on our website, and we refer to them a fair bit.
Great, thanks, Ol. That's helpful. And I know we saw a request from someone in the chat for the slides. So when we make those available, Bill, perhaps we could include links to the Auditor General, the report the reports on the petitions and their responses, and maybe all some links to your full petition, because I think on the Auditor General they only post a summary and then the government response. So
Yep,
we'll
do
do that as follow up. A question: is the referendum not binding now? How can we change or help now as a grassroots group? I'm going to send that one, I think, to David, although Bill might want to supplement. But David, can you just speak to the binding, non-binding nature of the referendum as being set out by South Bruce?
Well, I think what's happened is your South Bruce Council has entered into an agreement which essentially makes the referendum binding. So, you know, it's in my PowerPoint presentation, but the clauses in the agreement around willing host means that not only must the council abide by the decision, they have to speak in favor of the proposal for years and years to come. And they can do nothing to frustrate, delay, or stop the proposal, even if the science comes back saying that it is not appropriate or so on. Now, they're not to frustrate regulatory approvals. It's very interesting to me how that would be interpreted. Does that mean that council has no voice? Does that mean that they won't be seeking intervener funding, that they won't be doing peer review? Now, you know, would that peer review of critical, would that count as being frustrating or delay or interfering? There are a lot of questions that need to be answered before I think anybody takes a definitive stance. But again, I would say that council has a lot of explaining to do. Staff, I don't think, have properly prepared the response for the community, and there has to be a lot more dialogue, which again I would say should lead to a debate, and then and only then should people decide. I mean, I guess what I find most extraordinary is, why would you even sign the willing host agreement before you had the referendum? Like, why wouldn't the community have a stake, a huge stake, in shaping the referendum? Like, what kind of relationship is this? It seems like NWMO sent over an agreement. It is entirely in their favor. Reading it over, I can't see hardly anything that is advantageous to the community. It looks like it was NWMO's agreement. They pulled it out of their desk and they gave it to council and said, sign it. Now, if that's not true and council has a response and they push back and they put clauses in and off ramps and protections in there, then they ought to send us a track changes document. Okay, NWMO sent us over this document, and here are all the changes we made to it. Well, we lawyers all use a thing called track changes, which shows you in red strikeout and red additions how the contract was changed. Let's see it. Don't hide behind some agreement or some secret in-camera meeting. You're making decisions that are going to affect people for 140 years. This is truly 7 generations that this thing is going to extend, and then it's not going to go anywhere. It sits in the ground, and if it starts seeping or leaking, it could be extremely dangerous. So there's no way that this thing was a made in Bruce, South Bruce contract. But there's an easy way for council staff to prove that this was made in South Bruce. Show us and prove it. And they ought to do that before one single more nickel gets spent on this referendum, because I don't think the agreement is proper.
Thanks, David. Question from Sandy via David to Earl. Please comment on limitations of computer modeling, hugely relied upon by the CNSC.
Yeah, I already kind of started on that with the issue of the 1 millisievert dose and how non-transparent the ways that is calculated. I don't have much more to say, Sandy, about that. And I've never really been able to wrap my own head. I'll tell you one little anecdote, though, which is that for the NSDF, the workers would be exposed to both what we call ground gamma from the radioactive waste that's already in the ground, and they would be exposed to dust when more waste is dumped, particularly soil that is contaminated, some of it with alpha emitters. And we do find that the estimated radiation dose was all ground gamma, and they assumed that there was no dust dose associated with the dust inhalation at all, basically, which is shocking because these kinds of facilities we're talking about low and intermediate level waste that might be in loose form, definitely are problematic in terms of the air inhalation pathway. So it all depends on how you make your assumptions. And if you assume that that pathway is negligible, then your dose estimate is flawed.
Great, thanks all. A question from Ken. Nuclear Corporation campaigning paid for out of electricity bills. Does this mean all power consumers in Ontario or Canada help pay for this? Bill, do you want to take this one?
Just repeat that question again, Bernane, please.
So it's who's paying the bills. So Ken is asking, does this mean all electricity consumers in Ontario are paying the NWMO's bills, or is it all of Canada?
Well, it's certainly Ontario, where the majority of the nuclear energy is generated, and of course, our electric bill in Ontario is a major factor in contributing. I assume the same thing applies in New Brunswick. I do not know, I don't believe that any of the provinces that don't have nuclear power as the generator of electricity are paying. So it's primarily those locations, as the saying goes, that the polluter pays, and in this case, it's LPG and New Brunswick Power. So they are the ones that are collecting the money to pay for the NWMO expenditures as well as the ongoing costs of the DGR itself.
Great, thanks, Bill. Yeah, it's calculated based on the volume of waste. So I think it was 2022, Ontario Power Generation contributed 93% of the NWMO's budget. The remaining 7% comes from New Brunswick, small amount from Quebec because of the Gentil reactors, and a very small amount from Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. So it's mostly Ontario ratepayers. That's the deepest pocket. A question from Gracia. What have you heard from political parties? And is there even one Liberal who is asking questions? Bill or Ole, I know you were both part of the meetings with the MPs a few weeks ago in Ottawa. Do either of you want to step in on that one?
Well, a lot of political parties or a lot of MPs in Ottawa don't necessarily want to talk about any nuclear waste. It's a subject that is avoided a lot. There are some members of parliament, MPs, that are vocal in trying to help communities like Ignace and ourselves to make it visible that this is a bad project for the environment, for the safety of people. No matter what is said, there's a lot of risk associated with it, and those members of parliament are willing to help, but they're few and far between.
I'll just add, Bill, that you and I met with Brian Massey, the NDP MP for Windsor, who is very engaged in this and has been talking not just locally, but with people in the US who are concerned about the Great Lakes about this. So there are some.
Right.
Which is a great segue all to our next question. International waterway regulations must surely enter into this nonsense. David, I wonder if you could comment on any of the boundary water agreements, International Joint Commission, jurisdiction, anything around international boundaries that might be a factor here.
So that was very much part and parcel of the NWMO proposal way back in 2010, 2011, around the low level and intermediate level waste disposal. I think partially what scared off the minister was the involvement of people in Michigan. Now that, as I recall, that disposal came very close or went under Lake Huron. Again, this is going back a long, long way. which triggered a lot of concern on people's part. This is something different from that, but I do think that the next opening in this campaign has got to be the international piece, where we let our neighbors know that we're going to be disposing of nuclear waste in such a way that it's, this has a flavor of out of sight, out of mind, right? Like, if I was drawing water from Lake Huron or downstream or basically anywhere near this thing, I would have a lot of questions about how it was going to be operated. I mean, on the one hand, you don't want it to be open to the public and share a lot of information and make it accessible. That doesn't make any sense. Conversely, when you keep it a secret and people don't know what's going on, they don't have access to it, and they can't monitor it, and there's no reporting on it, that makes it equally suspicious or dangerous. So I think at the very least, there is a shoe to drop on this, and we ought to turn our attention to our friends over in Michigan and see if they don't want to get involved again, because they were active the last time around.
Great, thanks very much, David. Question from David. I believe the Canadian level for tritium in Canada is 70 times what the European Union is. Is this true? Or can you comment on tritium levels in Ontario or Canada relative to international standards?
Yeah, briefly, it's 7,000 becquerels per liter. A becquerel is the amount of a radioactive substance that gives off one disintegration every second. So you'd have a liter bottle of water that would be giving off 7,000 tritium disintegrations per second. Other countries say something closer to 100 would be safe. The Ontario Drinking Water Advisory Council said that we should move to 20, but it's still stuck at 7,000.
Thanks, Bill. And we're at 8:27, so I think we're approaching our wrap-up time, and we've got several questions in the queue. But let's say that we're going to deal with our 5 remaining questions, and then we'll sign off. A question from Ken. British government under Thatcher advanced the notion of only consulting or accepting views of directly affected citizens in questions about community willingness for big projects. They're so narrowly defined directly affected citizens that very few qualified to have their views heard. I've been involved in campaigns in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC where that tactic was used. Is that at work here? And maybe I'll pass it to Ole and to David to comment on what would be called standing or participant status in both the impact assessment process and CNSC licensing reviews. David, do you want to start us off on that?
So there is a somewhat long and checkered history with respect to citizens' engagement with the nuclear industry, licensing, so on and so forth. I think this really comes back to a matter of intervener funding. I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how well-intentioned you are. If you're just a normal, regular person, or, like a farmer or, a school teacher, or what have you, there's very little you can do to address these matters when they're burying this stuff deep underground. They have, traffic engineers and hydrogeologists. So on the one hand, I would say that the most important element is to get organized, so join up with a group, that there should be 1 or 2 voices. We don't need dozens and dozens of voices in this. And second, South Bruce failed residents. They've taken all the money for themselves. It's clearly they're in favor of the project. What have they done to demand from NWO intervener or participant funding? I mean, this is absolutely outrageous that they didn't demand this as part of the willing host agreement. Nobody should be a willing host unless the regulator in the first place, which in essence is NWMO. But anyway, the municipality failed residents by not requiring millions of dollars in intervener participant funding, so you can hire hydrogeologists, traffic engineers, agronomists, agrologists, you name it. There's a long list. NWMO will be taking your money and spending it on their experts. You are going to be baking muffins and selling them at the side of the road to try and raise money for your lawyers and for your experts. Like, believe me, I'm not going to be paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions of dollars on this file. There's no way. That's ridiculous. Their lawyer will be, and you're paying for it. South Bruce let you down.
Paul, do you want to just add in about access to the impact assessment hearing process and the licensing process for both individuals and for nonprofit community organizations?
It's a very frustrating process to appear and get your 10 minutes before the CNSC and then have your 10 minutes, what they call disposition, basically dismissed. But I think what I just, my hat's off to protect our waterways, to the people who are on this call for, I mean, this is really the where we get to hear and learn and discuss this. It's not going to be in a CNSC hearing room. It's through activities like this. And David's right. Join a group, stay involved, and work with your neighbors and friends on this.
Great. Thanks, all. Question from Janice. It's maybe more of a comment. What about responsibility for educating the public about the dangers of nuclear waste and radiation generally? Most of the industry just puts forth the benefits of nuclear power and minimizes
Slower, Bernane, that's too fast. That's
so. What about the responsibility? I'd encourage the panelists to also look at their at the Q&A list. So the question is about responsibility for educating the public about the dangers of nuclear waste and radiation. And Janice comments that the nuclear industry just puts forth the supposed benefits and minimizes the dangers. Now we know that renewables like solar and storage, heat pumps, etc., can meet almost all our energy needs without fossil fuels or nuclear. So I think the question, and maybe I'll put this to Bill, just a question about educating the public, and maybe any comment on the burden of all that education falling to the public, given the failure of the nuclear industry or the regulators to provide that objective kind of information and education.
Okay, thanks, Bernane. You know, the NWMO has an agenda, and its agenda really is to sell the community and the council and the staff in the community that this project will have benefits for them economically and socially. That is not their objective at all. The industry is more interested in getting rid of this waste and burying it in some location and then abandoning it. The fact is that it's a difficult struggle because you are up against people who believe that you know, this is going to have economic growth and population growth in a community, and that's yet to be seen. So sometimes again, what you see is information that's being provided by the NWMO is really just surface information. I'll give you an example. So if you looked at the document called the Design for the DGR Conceptual Document, which was written in September 2021, that document is full of all kinds of statements where it says we don't have site-specific information. And what does that really mean? It means all the studies that have been taking place are primarily preliminary. They're without any details relative to what is actually going to occur when you put this waste in the ground. So again, it's our job to highlight those areas. And often we're accused of, you know, providing false information. Well, that's not the case. The fact is you're providing information that the NWMO is not willing to share. And that's our job, fundamentally, is to get out and provide as much information to people, not to scare them, nobody should go into a situation without good knowledge. And good knowledge means both the benefits as well as the cons or the risk. And so far, I see absolutely nothing that talks about the risks. And we've been subjected to the information from the NWMO and the CLC communities within the communities, where all the information that is being presented is pro this project. There's only one presentation that was ever made where, in effect, Dr. Edwards raised some issues and some concerns relative to the project. Other than that, there's no risks being identified associated with this project. Any risks that are identified, they say they can mediate them. They can eliminate them by certain processes. Well, what are those processes? And we don't know that. So we're lacking good information about this whole project.
Great, thanks, Bill. Next question for David. Is there any legal test of competence to make a decision, i.e. that council had the training or unbiased science sources to make an informed decision? David, any tests of competence for elected decision makers? I can guess at the answer.
Well, if we had a test of competence, we should start with the provincial government. But anyway, no, unfortunately, there's not a test of competence, which again points to, I think, an unbelievable and fantastical outcome here, which is exactly how many high-level nuclear radioactive waste experts are there in South Bruce. Is the mayor or councillors, they have staff members who aren't paid by NWMO and they're expert with respect to this stuff. I mean, come on, this is an old story where somebody with deep pockets finds a beautiful little bucolic agricultural community and says, why don't you take a garbage dump? Why don't you take some big industrial facility that doesn't belong there and deal with somebody else's problems and waste? So this is an old story. Back in the kind of the 80s and 90s, when I first became an environmentalist, it was garbage dumps, trying to have a place to put its garbage. And so they'd go to these little communities that didn't have the expertise, the wherewithal, and so on. And they were almost bullied into taking these garbage dumps. Thank goodness we put intervener funding in place through the provincial government so that you could actually fund, and there were agreements that funded municipalities and funded citizens groups. But anyway, that's a long answer to what should have been a short answer. Question was, no, there's no competence test. And I don't think, look, you don't need a competence test. You need just a very simple management test. What kind of expertise does South Bruce have to deal with this kind of thing? And like, unless something has changed or there's something I don't know, they don't have the experts on staff to deal with this thing. And they shouldn't have signed that damn agreement until they did.
Great. Thanks, David. Next question, and I'm gonna intervene on this one a little bit. Ignace has had its referendum with results to be tentatively released in June. How will this impact the South Bruce referendum? But I just want to note that Ignace did not have a referendum. They had an online poll, which they're calling a vote, but it was not a referendum. It was an online poll. And the news this evening, Ignace Council was considering a staff report which suggested that perhaps the results will not be released, at least the report will not be released. So there will be a report go to Ignace Council sometime in probably June, maybe not till July, although NWMO offered them a signing bonus if they delivered their willingness decision by the end of June. But at this point, it's not clear whether the actual results of the online poll will be released based on what was in the staff report going to Ignace Council tonight. So having added in a news update from the site in Northwestern Ontario, Bill, how do you think a Ignace willingness decision, should it be delivered by the end of June for the signing bonus, for the end of July, which their commitment in their hosting agreement, how do you think that will impact the South Bruce referendum?
I don't think it will. So at the end of the day, they're totally different situations in Ignace versus South Bruce. So I don't think it will have any impact whatsoever. Even if it comes back as a willingness site, I cannot see how that will impact the residents of South Bruce.
And a question for all, and I see that we did have, we've added Andy and Holly have added questions. We said we were cutting off the questions. We're really going to cut it off after the question from Holly. A question for all. I understand there are currently 3 judicial review applications from the decision to build a nuclear waste dump at Chalk River. This is the near surface disposal facility. Will this halt the construction process? Well, I'm going to pass that to you first, because I know you're very familiar with those applications.
Yeah, there are 3 judicial reviews moving into the court system. One from the Caboec First Nation about the duty to consult, Section 35 of the Constitution Act, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There's a second one about that our group in a couple other groups are involved in, which has to do with the CNSCs, including Caboec. No, sorry. Yeah, there are 3 judicial reviews of that decision. One focuses on the CNSC, one focuses on UNDRIP and duty to consult, and one focuses on the species at risk approval from the Minister of Environment. And various parties are involved in each. Just Caboec on the one about the UN Declaration. I don't know. You don't need any more detail than that, I don't think.
Well, the questioner is wondering what the effect those judicial review applications might have on the construction timeline.
Yeah, can they start building it? And I think the answer, unfortunately, may be yes. And it could potentially require some sort of legal injunction to stop them from doing it. They probably won't start till the fall. They're not supposed to disrupt nesting migratory birds and so forth, but that window ends in September.
Renee, you're on mute.
From Andy, why can't we leave the nuclear waste at the nuclear facilities themselves? Less risk can be managed as part of the overall mitigation plan. Resources are already present at site. And I will say, excellent question. And my answer would be they can. They're just not choosing to. Well, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I totally agree with that rationale. We know that it's safely stored there today. We know that there's a whole bunch of issues if you take the waste out of the existing containers and put it in transportation containers and ship it to Ignace or South Bruce. That introduces a whole other series of risks associated with moving this waste. The nuclear industry would say, well, we got to figure out a long-term solution. And I hear this so many times. It's, the long-term solution, leave it where it is and develops better containers. The fact is that waste will always appear on the shores or at the reactor sites as long as we have nuclear generation. So it's going to be there for at least 30 years. So you're not removing a problem. You're actually introducing another problem by moving it to some other site. So we know that there's a proposal, has always been put forth by Dr. Edwards on the rolling stewardship management, but that's never been considered. The other thing is that there's just not enough money going into researching whether there is some other way we can reduce the radioactive components of this waste, this spent fuel waste. There is only, around the world. We spend all kinds of money talking about burying it in the DGR, but there's very little money that's actually been spent to see whether or not there's some other cure to the problem. And that's painful to me that that kind of a research is not going on.
Great, thanks, Bill. And I'll just put in a plug. Oh, David, you want to add? Go ahead.
Yes, I do. It's a good question. As far as I'm concerned, you have the deep igneous rock disposal mode. You have the leave in situ mode. You have the above ground secure facility mode and the alternative waste neutralization mode. What I say is they should put it in the CUM mode and be done with it.
Great, thanks, David. I'm going to just put in
My
a plug
attempted
and
humor.
say that there was a webinar on extending on-site storage as part of Northwatch series back in February. So you can go to northwatch.org and find the link to that section, because that's the focus. And that paper's out for discussion. So question for Holly. What can you say about the process happening in Ignace, where a poll was taken and it's going to be analyzed by a willingness committee, the ad hoc willingness committee, which gives the result to the council without the community, public, or council knowing the actual results. So Holly's referring to the same staff report I just commented on. I don't know, David, if you want to comment on that, just in terms of the legitimacy of that kind of a process.
Sorry, Bernard, you saying, I didn't follow the question. I apologize.
So Holly's asking, what do you say about the process happening in Ignace? So the process happening in Ignace was an online poll, some interviews, consultant report goes to an ad hoc willingness committees established in February. They make a recommendation to council. So it's quite different from the South Bruce process, problematic as it is. This is a beast with even different stripes. So any comment on that in being a decision-making process?
Well, first, it strikes me that it's much more organic and accessible, right? Like you can address this community. The committee is made up of your neighbors. It doesn't sound like there's a kind of a hard and fast, process there that's locked in. This one, it seems like, your only portal to affect the referendum or how the referendum is going to play out is through your council, and council, from what I can see, is been somewhat shut down in terms of signing this agreement. So I would say that the process in Ignace looks like it was made in Ignace. And the process in South Bruce, what you're hearing, was made, it seems like, at NWO headquarters, and that can't be right. Okay,
we're going to have to talk more about that, David, because I don't think that's the way the people in the Northwest see it. But we're going to go to our last question, which is from Alicia. And Alicia asked, since there's no good place for waste, how do we move away from nuclear power? When does citizens get to have input on that? And maybe we'll do a round robin on this. Maybe we'll hear from old David and Bill on the question about why continue to generate it when there's no acceptable process for managing it safely in the long term. And when do citizens get to have input on that? So let's go old David, Bill. Final words, Bill, and this is our final question.
All right.
Okay,
Well,
briefly,
nice if all of us would have had an opportunity to determine what the source.
David, we're going to go old David, you're back.
I'm last.
You're last.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ol.
All right.
in Germany, they did a planned phase out of nuclear power. It was rather successful, and I think in April of last year they closed their final nuclear power plant. It was controversial. There were lots of doubts, but what it did was it created investor certainty. People knew how much of a gap in gigawatt hours there would be when this plant closed and that plant closed, and the investors stepped up, and most that went into renewables. So that's the kind of process that works in terms of of a real phase out both of nuclear power and the nuclear waste it generates.
Great, thanks all. David.
I was very proud to be one of the originators of the Green Energy Act in Ontario. That had an enormous emphasis on conservation, which I still think is a huge untapped source of not generation per se, but every kilowatt saved is a kilowatt you don't have to generate. So I think that should be top of our minds. I think everybody the world over, whether it's China, Africa, are moving away from the gigantic centralized power generation facilities and moving into decentralized power. I think every homeowner, every landowner should be a generator of electricity. That's where the way the world's going. It seems like Ontario, Canada, we're lagging behind again. That's extremely unfortunate. It's unfortunate the Ford government canceled the Green Energy Act. It was at one point it was deemed the best renewable energy program in North America. I guess the funny thing about nuclear power is everybody says, well, we need it, we want it, we got to have it. It leads to some extraordinarily unintended consequences. So, for example, I represent a group called Save the Bay, who are fighting against the Trans-Canada Pipeline facility. They're going to blow a 400-acre hole on the CFB Meaford. They're going to do pump storage, where they pump billions of liters up into this reservoir every night, let it rush down during the day, turning the generators, and then pump it back up at night. That, of course, is just a subsidy for the Bruce nuclear power plant, which of course will sell them electricity at the night, so that TransCanada can sell the electricity during the day at a substantially higher price. So, again, you talk about nuclear power and how renewable it is, not if you're going to blow a 400-acre hole in the Niagara Escarpment. And finally, when people talk about nuclear power, I ask you to think of Fukushima, right? Where you had firefighters hosing down a nuclear power plant. This is out of the Middle Ages, where people would put out fires on thatched roofs. These things have unintended, unseen consequences. And in light of the climate change crisis that we have, we shouldn't be introducing enormous, huge, new centralized power facilities. We need to decentralize. That's the way Africa and China are going. In Europe, that's the way we should be going.
Great, thanks, David. And Bill, I'm going to pass it over to you for a response from Alicia's question and to just do our final wrap up for the evening. So thanks very much.
Right. What worries me most about Ontario in particular is that we have not got as renewable energy sources underway. It's a shame because the rest of the world is going that way, and we're going to be left behind, as David said. The fact is the omission of solar, wind, and also hydro and other means of reducing consumption is something we just don't hear enough about. And so it's very disappointing that a country like Canada, who's rich in those kinds of resources, don't use them. God gave us those resources. We should be using them. And we shouldn't invent other things that are not nature-made, they're man-made. And that's an issue I have. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank both David and Ollie and Bernane, yourself, for getting this webinar of interest to all of us, and for the participation and the time you took to get yourselves ready for what I consider a very interesting and very topical subject at this point in time. And so with that, I want to also thank those people that attended and listened to some of the information that may you're not hearing from, your councils or your staff, municipal staff, or the NWMO. So again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy evenings, and I know everybody's busy. And thank you again. With that, let's close it, Bernane, and you're on mute again, Bernane.
Thanks everyone for your participation, and we will follow up with some links and some details that we committed to in the course of the webinar. So Thank you,
And it
Bill.
is recorded,
Protect our
Renee.
waterways as always.
Yeah, and it is recorded, so we will have it on our site and you'll have it on other sites as well. So we will get access to it in the future. Thank you.